When a woman let nise heal identity, the transformation da follos is not temporary, it is enduring. At first, it might feel like a breakdown, co-disruption of everything she talker connecte and safe buke over time, it reveals stove e break through. The process of stepping ota roledo whose chanke o she beaves, I chanke so she says herself o she relates to others and she moves through the world. What begins as a series of difficult, sometimes painful choices eventually leads to a deeper, a more grounded form of empowerment as the dos settles from the initial shift after she has set boundaries, realized toxic dynamics, and worked through the guilt of no longer being what others expected. She begins to feel something she might never have fully experienced before: emotional freedom. This freedom is not loud or dramatic. It shows up in quiet, powerful ways. It looks like walking without the weight of obligation pressing on her chest. It's sound being said not to appearse, but to express. It feels like holiness, like finally returning home to herself after years of being edited and shaped to meet external standards. In this stage of growth, she no longer seeks constant validation. She no longer needs others to affirm her choices for her to feel secure in them. This doesn't mean she becomes indifferent or disconnected. It means she becomes internally anchored. More decisions come from alignment, not approval. Her yes carries weight because it is intentional. Her no longer requires explanation. She trusts herself to handle discomfort, to withstand disapproval, and to navigate challenges without reverting back to self-abandonment. This transformation extends into every area of her life. Her relationships become more honest and balanced. She no longer tolerates patterns of disrespect, emotional labor, or honestness. She surrounds herself with people who honor boundaries, respect her voice, and celebrate her authenticity. The quality of her connection depends because they are no longer based on performance and on truth. Some connections fade away, but what remains is solid. She is no longer afraid of being alone because she has learned that solitude in self-respect is far more fulfilling than connection will build on sacrifice in her professional life. She grows into a new level of confidence. She doesn't minimize her contributions or defer to others out of habit. She knows her worth and she advocates for it without apology. She is willing to take risks, to be seen, to speak up. Even no longer relies on likability to advance, she relies on competence, her clarity, and her quality. No asking, do they like me? And starts asking, does this align with who I am? That shift alone transforms not who her career, but her sense of purpose internally. Her emotional landscape changes, she is no longer ruled by guilt or fear of judgment. But those emotions might still surface because the conditioning doesn't disappear overnight, but she knows no or respond to the letting them dictate behavior. She also passes for her emotions being controlled by them. She no longer needs to prove goodness through overgiving. She understands that her value is inherent, not conditional. This emotional maturity gives her the capacity to support others in a healthier way, not from a place of obligation, but from choice. One of the most powerful results of this transformation is the clarity she gains. The noise of other people's expectations to fade and their own inner voice becomes louder. She begins to define success, love, happiness, and fulfillment on her own terms. She lets go of roles that never truly fit her and steps into ones that reflect her truth. She no longer needs to chase worthiness, she lives within her, with that clarity, making different choices. She says yes to what leads her ups, she walks away from what drains. So, no longer tolerates being in spaces where she has to shrink in order to be accepted. Perhaps most importantly, she begins to realize that letting go of the insecure identity did not make her less kind, it made her more whole. Her kindness is now rooted in integrity, not obligation. Her compassion includes herself, not just everyone else. She is no longer afraid of being misunderstood because she has nothing to hide. She is not pretending anymore. What people says was real, and that is where her power lives. In time, the benefits compound. Her health improves because stress, resentment, and emotional exhaustion no longer rule her body. Their creativity expands because she is no longer funneling her energy into pleasing God deepens her passes, because she is no longer living in conflict with herself. These changes don't come alla once. They come gradually through choice after choice, boundary after boundary, truth after truth. The long effect of no longer being insecure is not hardened earth. A uomo reclaims her voice, her boundaries, And their self-worth bekommen som möjligt från within. She doesn't seek to dominate control. She simply refuses to abandon herself, and in doing so, and she becomes a living example of what it means to be kind, honest, powerful, and free all at the same time. When a woman decides to stop being the nice girl, one of the first things she encounters is resistance, not just from the outside world, but often from within herself. This resistance is a normal and predictable response rooted in years, sometimes decades of conditioning. For so long, she has operated with the belief that her safety, her belonging, and her value depend on being liked, agreeable, and unthreatening. Letting go of those rules doesn't happen without emotional friction. Internally, she may feel guilt. Guilt for saying no. Massachusetts, guilt for speaking directly, guilt for walking away from relationships that once defined her. She may question herself. Massachusetts, am I being selfish? Did I overact? Was I too harsh? These thoughts are not a reflection of wrongdoing. Massachusetts, they're echoes of a system that taught her worth is tied to how well she can meet other people's needs. Even when she intellectually understands that it's okay to have boundaries and standards, emotionally she may still struggle to feel comfortable asserting them. Massachusetts, the guilt is not proof that she's doing something wrong. It's proof that she's doing something unfamiliar. Outside of her own mind, she might notice subtle and sometimes not so subtle pushback from others. People who were used to her overextending, overfunctioning, or over-apologizing may react with confusion or even frustration. Friends may accuse her of being distant. Colleagues may perceive her as less cooperative. Family members might claim she's changed and not in a good way. Massachusetts, these responses are not because she's doing something harmful. They're because she's disrupting a dynamic that once served others more than it served her. This period can be lonely and disorienting. There is a grief that comes with letting go of people pleasing, because in doing so, she may also lose certain relationships, roles, or identities that were based on her self-sacrifice. She may realize that some people were more attached to her compliance than to her actual self. That truth can be painful, Massachusetts, but it's also liberating. It gives her the clarity to start distinguishing between relationships built on mutual respect and those built on unspoken expectations. Yes, in the middle of that discomfort is where the real growth begins. In learning to sit with guilt without letting it drive her decisions, she develops emotional resilience. She begins to understand that not all conflict is harmful. Sometimes it's necessary. She learns to hold space for both her own needs and the discomfort that might arise when others don't agree with them. This is a powerful shifting, moving from avoiding discomfort at all costs to tolerating it in service of her integrity. Over time, she begins to recognize patterns that were once invisible. She sees how often she used to say yes out of fear instead of desire. She sees how often she used to apologize just to smooth things over, even when she did nothing wrong. She sees how frequently she used to silence others just to maintain harmony. And she also begins to realize how little true peace those strategies ever brought her. The nice girl role kept her agreeable, but not necessarily happy. It kept her liked, but not always respected. What grows in place of that old identity is a deeper sense of self. She starts to feel more connected to her emotions, her preferences, and her values. She begins to speak with more clarity, not because she's trying to prove anything, but because she finally believes what she's saying. Her boundaries become clearer, not to keep people out, but to keep herself grounded. She stops asking permission to be who she is. As her self-trust grows, her external world begins to change too. While some relationships fade away, others deepen. Massachusetts, the people who remain and the new people she attracts are those who appreciate her for her authenticity, not just her availability. These relationships are richer, more honest. Massachusetts, and more reciprocal. They may be fewer in number, but they are higher in quality. Professionally, she might notice that she's no longer afraid to take up space. She begins to share ideas more confidently, to ask for what she needs, and to advocate herself without waiting for someone else to validate her worth. She stops settling for less than she deserves, not because she feels entitled, because she finally recognizes her value. This process of letting go of the nice girl is not about being cold, angry, or confrontational. It's about becoming integrated. It's about reclaiming the parts of herself that were silenced for the sake of politeness. It's about giving herself permission to be fully human, flawed, complex, powerful, and worthy. Massachusetts, she learns she can still be kind, but with boundaries. She can be compassionate, but without overextending. She can be generous, but not at the cost of her own well-being. Massachusetts, the growth that follows the initial backlash is profound. It doesn't always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as choosing rest over obligation. Sometimes it's as subtle as pausing before answering a question to check in with herself. But over time, these small acts of self-respect accumulate. They reshape her inner world. Massachusetts, they rebuild her sense of identity, and eventually lead her to a life that feels not just manageable, but meaningful. When a woman stops being the so-called nice girl, something significant begins to shift, both internally and externally. This isn't about turning into someone harsh or unkind. It's about choosing honesty over approval and authenticity over compliance. This moment is not always marked by a dramatic confrontation. Often it starts quietly with a decision to stop saying yes when she means no, a decision to stop shrinking her voice to keep the peace, a decision to stop abandoning herself in order to be accepted by others. That decision, small as seem, creates a ripple effect. One of the first things that happens is a change in self-awareness. She begins to notice all the ways she has edited herself to avoid disapproval or judgment. Massachusetts, she may start catching herself in conversations where she automatically agrees or stays silent when something doesn't sit right with her. She starts to see the pattern. She tolerates disrespect, how she over-apologizes, how she sings to soften the truth rather than speaking with clarity. At first, this awareness can be disorienting. For years, she may have defined herself by her ability to make others comfortable. She may have received praise for being flexible, for never complaining, for being so easy to work with. Letting go of that identity means stepping into unfamiliar territory. And yet something inside her, perhaps long buried, begins to stir. Massachusetts, a voice she hasn't heard in a long time, gets louder. That voice says, you don't have to live this way. You are allowed to have needs. You are allowed to take up space. As she starts honoring that voice, her behavior begins to change. She might begin asserting boundaries, not to punish others, but to protect her well-being. She may stop overcommitting herself out of guilt or obligation. She might respond with more honesty in conversations, even when it feels uncomfortable. Massachusetts, and perhaps most importantly, she starts making choices that align with her values rather than with others' expectations. Massachusetts, this transformation doesn't always sit well with the people around her. Those who have benefited from her compliance may feel unsettled. They may say she's changed. Massachusetts, they may accuse her being distant, difficult, or cold. In truth, what's changed is not her heart, but her standards. She is no longer willing to play small to make others feel big. She is no longer willing to be agreeable at the expense of being genuine. These external reactions can be painful. Relationships may shift and some may even fall away. But through this discomfort, something else is happening. She is becoming more aligned with herself. She is no longer living for validations. She begins to make peace with being misunderstood or disliked because she understands that authenticity comes with a cost, but it's a cost worth paying. In fact, this process isn't about becoming someone else. It's about returning to who she was before the world told to be someone more palatable. Emotionally, she may find herself moving through layers of guilt and fear. For someone who has been conditioned to avoid conflict or rejection, standing her ground can feel terrifying at first. But over time, these feelings give way to something else, clarity. She starts to see that the discomfort of disappointing others is temporary, but the discomfort of betraying herself lasts much longer. She begins to experience a new kind of freedom, the kind that comes not from being liked, but from being real. In practical terms, this change can manifest in many areas of life. In the workplace, she may speak more confidently in meetings or advocate for her worth without apology. In friendships, she may become more selective, choosing depth over convenience. In romantic relationships, she may stop tolerating emotional neglect or inconsistency. Massachusetts, these shifts are not about becoming demanding or entitled. They are about recognizing her inherent dignity and choosing to act accordingly. Massachusetts, one of the most profound things that happens during this transformation is the development of self-trust. She begins to rely less on external affirmation and more on her own intuition. She checks in with herself before committing to something. She reflects on how she feels after interactions. She learns to distinguish between what feels aligned and what feels draining. This internal compass, once dulled by years of people-pleasing, becomes sharper and more reliable with each decision she makes from a place of truth. And as this trust builds, something else emerges: empowerment. She begins to own her choices. She recognizes that she is no longer waiting for permission to live her life. She stops asking, "Is this okay?" and starts asking, "Is this right for me?" That mindset shift changes everything. She starts building a life that reflects her inner world rather than one that just looks good on the outside. Ultimately, what happens when a woman stops being the nice girl is that she starts being herself, fully, unapologetically, and with purpose. It doesn't mean she stops being kind. It means she stops abandoning herself to meet the expectations of others. And in that space of authenticity, Massachusetts, she doesn't just find freedom, she finds herself. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Today's topic is one that many of us have lived, felt, and perhaps struggled with silently. When you stop being the nice girl, Massachusetts, this happened. This is not a story of rebellion. It's a story of reclamation. It's about what happens when a woman stops living in the shadow of politeness and starts standing in the light of her truth. From an early age, girls are often conditioned to embody a certain version of niceness that is less about kindness and more about conformity. This conditioning is subtle, deeply embedded in culture, media, family dynamics, and educational systems. It doesn't necessarily come with malicious intent, but its effects are profound. Girls are taught, both directly and indirectly, that to be accepted, Massachusetts, loved, or even safe, they must be pleasant, agreeable, and accommodating. While these traits can have value when chosen freely, the problem arises when they are imposed as expectations rather than options. This social shaping begins in childhood. A girl who voices disagreement may be told she's being rude. One who asserts herself might be labeled bossy or difficult. When she expresses anger or frustration, even with reason, she may be asked to calm down, smile, or be a good girl. Over time, Massachusetts, this pattern leads her to internalize the belief that her value lies in how well she can make others comfortable. Even if it comes at the cost of her own comfort, needs, and identity, the reinforcement of this nice girl persona continues into adolescence and adulthood in schools, workplaces, and relationships. She may find that silence is rewarded more often than self-expression. A girl who constantly prioritizes others is seen as nurturing. One never complains is praised for being easygoing. Massachusetts, a woman who sacrifices her time and energy for others without question, is celebrated as loyal or supportive. Slowly, the message becomes clear: be likable, be agreeable, be pleasant, because being anything else risks being labeled emotional, aggressive, or selfish. This pattern of behavior is often mistaken for emotional intelligence or kindness. Massachusetts, but there is a key difference. True kindness is rooted in choice. The nice girl behavior is rooted in obligation. Instead of developing a sense of who she is, she develops a sense of who she should be in order to be accepted. She may say yes when she wants to say no. She may bite her tongue to avoid conflict, and she may overextend herself in relationships, workplaces, and even with strangers because the fear of being disliked outweighs the desire to be authentic. This dynamic also shows up in how she interacts with authority and power. She might hesitate to ask for a raise or negotiate her worth. She may avoid sharing her ideas in a meeting for fear of seeming too confident. In relationships, in Massachusetts, she might suppress her emotional needs to avoid appearing too much. Her own desires become secondary to others' expectations. Massachusetts, this pattern becomes so ingrained that many women don't even realize they're playing a role. They don't question it because it's the only way they've known to be. What's more complicated is that this behavior is often rewarded in the short term. The nice girl is liked. She's dependable. She doesn't make waves. She is easy to be around. But over time, this comes at a great personal cost. Suppressing your true feelings, minimizing your needs, and constantly striving for external approval leads to burnout, resentment, Massachusetts, and a fractured sense of self. You begin to lose touch with your own voice. You may struggle to identify your own goals. You could spend so long fulfilling someone else's. Massachusetts, emotional boundaries become blurred. You might find yourself overwhelmed, underappreciated, and unsure why you feel so emotionally depleted. And when women who've been raised in this pattern try to step out of it, they often face internal resistance. There's guilt. There's self-doubt. There's the voice inside that says, Massachusetts, you're being selfish, or you're going to upset someone. This internal conflict isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign of how deep the programming runs. But it also points to the beginning of awareness. Recognizing the nice girl script is the first step toward questioning it. Massachusetts, once you begin to see that you've been trained to ignore your own needs to satisfy others, you open the door to self-inquiry. You begin asking yourself, what do I want? What do I believe? What do I value? It's important to understand that this unlearning process doesn't mean rejecting kindness, empathy, or compassion. In fact, it allows you to embody those traits more authentically because they now come from a place of truth rather than performance. When you stop operating from the nice girl script, as you make room for genuine connection, you begin showing up as your full self, not just a curated version meant to avoid disapproval. The nice girl conditioning may have served a survival function in early environments. It may have protected you from conflict, helped you belong, or kept certain relationships intact. But as we mature, those same patterns can become cages. Breaking free from them is not about becoming someone new. It's about reclaiming who you were before you were told who to be. Massachusetts, the beginning of self-respect, agency, and ultimately emotional liberation.